I'm Greg Sandow, and I'm sitting here with somebody who is completely unabashed about saying that he is not part of the orchestra world.
That's for sure.
And has no compunction about talking about other things, which in fact is the reason we brought him here. This is Ralph Locke. He is professor of musicology at the Eastman School of Music. And Ralph, we have, as we just worked out 5 minutes ago, 2 agenda items. One of them is the work you've done translating some material by Franz Liszt from way back in his time in the 19th century that seems oddly prophetic of where we are now. And then, which I have to admit was my idea, but you're happy to talk about it, right?
Right.
The rather extraordinary paper you wrote on what I might call the social responsibility of a musicologist, how a musicologist can make some difference in the world outside scholarship.
Right. Happy to talk about both of those.
Great. So starting with item 1, tell us about what you found out about Liszt.
Well, I was asked by the organizers of the Bard Festival to translate an essay by Liszt that Liszt wrote in 1835 when he was 23, one of his first published essays that had never been published before. It's never been translated before. It had been published in the original French. He was living in Paris, and he wrote this long essay. It was so long that it was published in 6 installments, and then there was an addendum as well. So there are really 7 installments, none of which has ever been translated in full. And there were doubts about its authorship because Liszt did get some help on some of his later writings from his first mistress, Marie Dagout, and then on the later ones from his second mistress.
You know, parenthetically,
yes.
If we're going to talk about composers having help with their published writings, we might mention the name Stravinsky, who never really committed a note to paper under his name without having somebody else.
Word to paper.
Yes,
right.
Word to paper, exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
It's very similar there.
Yes. Did I say notes to paper?
Yeah, right.
I guess I did. Well, those he did by himself.
Right.
We know that.
No, that's true with Stravinsky, the autobiography, the poetics,
exactly.
And all those.
So Liszt is in good company here if he did have some help.
Absolutely, but there's an autograph did show up, and it's in the British Library now, and it's in his own hand with his crossouts where he changed his ideas about what word he wanted to use, and that's the 6th installment, what he intended to be the final installment, though there was then finally an addendum as well. And where he sums up all of his ideas and his specific recommendations, and because that exists in his own hand, the editors of this book that was published for the Bard Festival, Liszt in His World. And
just take a moment on the Bard Festival. I'll just fill this in. For those who don't know about it, this takes place every summer at Bard University, north of New York City, along the Hudson River. Leon Botstein, the president of the festival and also the music director of the American Symphony Orchestra, organizes a festival always about one composer. The depth that is gone into in panel discussions and concerts could be extraordinary. And one of the results is always a book of stimulating essays on the composer. So you happen to have been asked to take part the summer they did Liszt.
Which was 2 summers ago.
Yeah.
2006. And I was delighted to translate this essay from the French and to write a commentary on it as well. And to think briefly also about the ways in which this echoes resonates for us today. Because it might be interesting for me to read the 8 postulates or 8 recommendations that Liszt made at age 23 in 1835. He said there should be a competition every 5 years for works in the major musical genres. He said that these new works would therefore form a new musical museum, as if they were hanging on a wall. Second, he wanted there to be music education in the schools. I think this is interesting because, of course, the question of funding music education in the schools is very problematic right now. Been a lot of cuts for music and arts. Third, reform of church music, and of course there have been lots of battles about what kind of music is appropriate for church through the years. 4 state-sponsored festivals of symphonic music, so some of the great works could get adequate performances. In a sense, we can think of that as being analogous to government support for symphony orchestras. Active encouragement of opera recitals and chamber music. We wouldn't expect this from Liszt necessarily. We think of him as a performing virtuoso, and he also was an active conductor in Germany in the 1850s. But we don't think of him as a chamber musician or as being much involved in opera, but that was very important to him too. 6, this is interesting to me, maybe as a member of the Eastman School faculty, a new and different music school. A different kind of music school. And if you want to know what he had in mind, he specifically recommends courses in music history and aesthetics. He feels that musicians need to be broadly educated, in other words, not just trained in flexible fingers and so on. And then finally, inexpensive editions of the greatest musical works of the past. He wanted students to be able to have access to copies of the music themselves so they can study and mark them up. And he says, again, very flattering for musicologists, scholarly studies and dissertations that explore and explain the masterworks. So Liszt definitely wanted some of us around.
Some of this appears surprising, at least to me, from what may be a superficial knowledge of the period. Why, for example, would Liszt be calling for competitions for composers when I think our perception is that back then new music was far more a general part of the music scene than it is now? It was not often a corner by itself, but Liszt was to go on to have a thriving career as a composer. And for Liszt, for Schumann, for Verdi, for Donizetti, for endless 19th century composers we could name, for Wagner, being a composer did not appear to be a problematic thing. So why did he want competitions to further what I might think was already happening? He must have had something in mind.
Well, he did, and he specifically said that what is expected of a composer and a performing musician in society is often superficial music. He complained that many musicians were making dance music in dance halls for the middle class, the working public, and so on. And the aristocrats wanted a notable virtuoso to come into the house, usually through the servants' entrance, and then to perform lively tunes, touching ballads, and so on, but nothing very musically demanding.
And he would know, wouldn't he? Because
yes.
He was doing that.
Yes, and he complained about that. Yes. He complained that he was only people wanted him to play dance music and the latest opera comique tune and do fancy variations on it and so on.
The funny thing, he wrote all those fantasies on operatic hits of the day, so he obliged.
Oh, definitely, and he did them extremely well.
Yes.
We have to say that if that's the kind of music that the superficial aristocrats wanted to hear, he at least did it in an amazing fashion.
So, it seems to me underlying every one of these points is the idea that he wanted the music world to be more serious than it was.
Right. He specifically said, I come to people's homes, and the merest bagatelle is received with salvos of applause, whereas a masterpiece by Beethoven or Schubert is met with awkward silence. And people don't know what to make of it. He wants people. He wants to raise the level of listeners to a level of discernment where they can really appreciate the great works.
And he wants the great works to be more disseminated. He wants people to be able to buy them, and not just music students, but I imagine anybody.
Absolutely.
Take them home and play them, which did happen. That's one of his recommendations, I think, that managed to evolve. And then he wants there to be more serious study of music historically, which was certainly brand new.
For sure.
Back then. And explain how some of the other points fit in his time.
Well, you raised the